Morning, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at data retention. So, as normal with these masterclasses, if anyone has any questions as we run through the session, if you want to drop them into the chat, and then we can pick those up. And the session's also being recorded, so you'll get the chance to revisit it as well if you need to. So today the topic is data retention. So we're going to be looking at data retention in both Jadu Central forms and also in Jadu Connect. The reason that we're running this on data retention is that it's one of those topics that's fairly important in terms of how you're managing your customer data. So there are a number of reasons why you want to look at implementing some kind of data retention on your forms and in Jadu Connect if you're using Jadu Connect. One is obviously to ensure that you're compliant with your GDPR standards. So obviously internally, you will have guidance around how long you keep customer data for. And in terms of GDPR, the guidelines really state that you should only keep it for as long as you need it. Just nice and vague, but everyone will determine sort of on an organization basis how long you need to keep that information for. So it's important that you're able to clear down that data when it becomes required. The other reason is probably just more of a technical reason. Just that, if you don't implement data retention in your system, then all of your form submissions will build up in the system, taking up space on your server. So it's good to have some kind of process whereby that data gets cleared down, so you don't end up sort of filling your server with form submissions going back years, because you can. It'll take time, but you could, in theory, eventually run out of space on the server if it's full of form submission data. So I'm going to start by looking at data retention in Jadu Forms and show you a couple of different ways that you can enable data retention, both on a global scale and also on a form-by-form basis. So if, for example, you've got a form where you need slightly different retention policies for it to the standard ones that you're implementing, then you can change that on a form-by-form basis. And we'll also look at data retention in terms of Jadu Connect, which at the moment is managed by using dashboard filters alongside the API. There are plans on the roadmap to implement more of a sort of customizable user interface for managing data retention, though. So in terms of central forms, within forms itself, you'll find that there's in the main menu an option for data retention. What this does is it gives you the ability to set up global data retention policies to determine how long you store form data in the database for. And these policies can be set up around the type of user and also the status of that form. So, for example, I might want to create policies relating to forms that a user has submitted or started to complete, but maybe not submitted. So we may decide that after a period, we don't want that unfinished form data sitting in the system. We want to clear it down. But with Jadu Central, if you're using user registration, you have a number of different potential scenarios. So you have potentially anonymous, unregistered users completing forms. So these are users that can't come back and pick a form up at a later date if they've partially completed it. But you also have internal users, so staff completing forms via their internal forms view, and possibly registered users completing forms when they're signed into their account. And both those two users can actually come back and pick up a form at a later date if they've partially completed it. So it may be that you might want different retention policies around those partially completed forms. So for example, if I've got an unregistered user, so I'll check the box to say that this retention policy relates to unregistered user. And I could say if the form status is incomplete, because this user type can't come back at a later date and pick that form submission up, I might decide that actually we'll clear down the data after a day. We'll assume they've not sat in front of their screen for a day trying to fill the form in, and assume that they've gone off to do something else. So on this policy, I can say if it's an unregistered user, the form is incomplete, we will keep the form data for a day and then we'll clear it down. Now, in terms of data types, there's two types of data in relation to forms in the system. There's what we call user data, which is the data that the user has actually input and any data that relates directly to them. And there's also what we call the entire submission, which is effectively it clears down any record that form was even started. So it may be that you might have a retention policy that just relates to user data because you might want to run statistics at a later point to see how many of those forms were submitted, but maybe for a comparison at a point after a date where you've maybe cleared down the user input. So for this particular rule, I'm going to say I'm just going to clear the user data. So any information that the customer has input. And I'll check the box to say I understand that actually once that data is deleted, it can't be recovered. When you run a retention policy and it clears the data, that data's gone for good. There's no way of pulling it back. So if I save that, I've got a global data retention policy that we applied to every form when it's being completed by an unregistered user if it's left incomplete. So I could also set up additional policies in here. So I might decide, well, I've also got internal users and registered users who do have that ability to come back to a form at a later date. So what I might decide is that if a form is incomplete for either of those two user types, maybe we'll keep the data for a longer period to give them a bigger window to come back and pick that form up. So I might say we'll maybe keep that form data for 4 weeks. So once the user started the form, if they come away, they've got 4 weeks to go back to their My Account page or to the internal forms view if they're an internal user and pick that form submission up again and complete it. Again, I'll say this is specifically for user data, and I understand that it's gone for good once that's run. So I've got a couple of policies there to do with incomplete forms. Now, in terms of the form builder, there's effectively 3 statuses. There's incomplete, submitted, and retentioned. So what I also want to do here is add a policy to manage the user data when a form's been submitted. So what I might do is I might have an internal policy that says that whenever a form's submitted, we keep that data for 2 years as standard. So I'm going to say when a form's 2 years old and the status is submitted, and it's any of the user types, because once it's submitted, it's submitted. It doesn't really need to differentiate between individual user types at this point. We're just keeping whatever data was submitted for a 2-year period. At the end of that period, we'll clear down the user data. And one thing I should say, you may see that there's a number of different statuses in my drop-down. This is because my demo install's got a legacy version of the form builder built into it as well. So we're looking specifically at the new form builder. So you'll just have those 3 statuses of submitted, incomplete, and retention. So for this one, 2 years old, it's been submitted, any type of user will clear down the user data. And we understand that that's going to remove that data. Now, when any of these policies run, when it removes the user data, it will move that form to a status of retention. So that essentially just means that there's no personal data or data the user's input associated with that form anymore. There will still be sort of a stub record of the form reference number, when it was started, when it was submitted, if it was submitted. So that gives you data that, as I said, you can run statistics against if you need to and reporting against. But there's probably going to be a point in time where we want to clear down that information as well. So I'm going to create a new policy. And let's say maybe we'll keep the stub record for an extra couple of years. So we'll say when the form is 4 years old and the status is retentioned and it's any user type, then we'll clear down the record of the entire submission. So at that point, it will remove any reference to the fact that that form submission was even started. And I can then save that. So effectively, what we then have here is 4 rules covering potential scenarios to ensure that we only keep the customer data for as long as it's required in line with our internal GDPR guidelines. So these rules effectively will be applied to every single form that's built in the system. Now, there may be instances where there may be particular forms that you potentially want to apply different data retention periods to. So there may be something unusual about that form that just means you need to treat it slightly differently. So in that scenario, if I jump to my so here I've got a business inquiry form. So this is an individual form. Now I've built my form, I've got my page layout, all that good stuff. You'll notice I have a tab here called data retention. Now what this tab allows you to do is to override the global retention policies for that particular form and set your own specific policies in relation to it. So if I select override retention policies, as soon as I've switched that on, at the moment, there's no data retention policies applying to this form because I've effectively switched off the global policies. Now, what I could do is I can go in and build those individual policies in exactly the same way for this particular form. So I can decide, maybe for this one, if it's submitted, maybe with this one, we need to maintain it for 3 years rather than 2 years because of some statutory reason or other. So I can go in and I can go in and complete that. As an alternative, though, to building those individual policies, they're literally built in exactly the same way as the global policies are. For individual forms, you also have a separate option to clear user data on submission. So what this means is that effectively, as soon as that form is submitted, the data is deleted from the system. You would only tend to use this if you are passing that data somewhere else, so you no longer need it in the system. So if, for example, you're raising a case in Jadu Connect, you've passed the data into Jadu Connect, therefore you no longer need it in the forms database in Jadu Central. Now, this does do a number of checks before it deletes the data. So if I switch this on, if I've got any rules in my form, so if I jump in here, so I've got a couple of rules to create cases in Jadu Connect, and these all have a number of actions associated with them. What this will do is if I switch this option on, it will check that all of those actions have been completed successfully before it deletes the data. So if, for example, it fails to raise the case in Jadu Connect, then it won't delete the data. It will still retain it here within the forms database so that you have access to it, because obviously it's not been successfully able to pass that over to Jadu Connect. And in terms of those rule actions, one thing that's worth being aware of is you can actually go in and configure email alerts to notify you when an action fails. So I could say, actually, if it fails to create a case, then I want it to send me either an instant notification, or I could say I don't want it instantly. I want it in a daily digest, or maybe I want it in both. So effectively, if that action fails when the form's submitted, I will receive a notification to let me know that that's happened. But in terms of data retention, this will only trigger if all of your actions have successfully triggered. Now, outside of your sort of standard retention policies, you may have occasions where you're specifically asked by a customer for you to remove their data from a submission. Now, if you have sufficient privileges in the system, you are able to log in and do that directly. So if I go to, let me find a form where I've got a received form. Let's have a look at this one. So I've got a number of received forms in this system. So let's say customer rings up, gives me their form reference and says, I would like you to delete my details from that form submission under GDPR regulations. You can go into that form submission from the received forms section. And if you have sufficient privileges, you will have a link to remove personal data. If you select that, it does give you a warning to say that what you're about to do isn't reversible. And then I'll click that, and immediately it retentions that form submission. So you can say it doesn't contain any answers. It doesn't show the IP address that it was submitted from anymore. All the information that we have in relation to that form is literally the date and time it was started, the date and time it was submitted, and it also records who removed the data in this case. So there's always a bit of an audit trail if there's ever a question about who actually removed the data. So data retention in Jadu Central Forms is relatively straightforward to set up. It's something, as I said, that we do always recommend that you set up in some way, just to ensure that you're managing your customer data in line with whatever your GDPR guidelines are, but also just to ensure that you're not filling your server up with form submissions that don't need to be there. We've had a suggestion for a future masterclass, so getting the best out of Jadu reports from Rana, and creating a dashboard of results. Yeah, that's certainly something we can look at. We're going to open up. So if you do have any suggestions for future masterclasses, anything that you particularly like to look at, you can just either drop it into the chat today or drop me an email, and we can always look at what people are looking at, what people particularly want to know about as well. Okay. So does anyone have any questions they want to drop in the chat about data retention in terms of Jadu Central Forms? Okay. So to talk about data retention in Jadu Connect. Now, at the moment, this has to be managed through the service API, so it's not as straightforward currently. However, there are plans on the roadmap to introduce more of a configurable user interface like the one that we have in Forms, so that you can configure retention policies in Jadu Connect. I know that's something that people have been asking for, and it's certainly something that the product team have put on the roadmap. But in terms of data retention in Connect at the moment, it does use the service API alongside a filter, dashboard filter. So effectively, you can use the service API to look at a dashboard filter and remove the details from any cases that are contained within that dashboard filter. What it does is when you redact a case in Connect, it will remove any data from fields that have been marked as sensitive data fields. So when you create a field in Jadu Connect, find an example. You have this checkbox where you can select if it contains sensitive data. So these are the fields that will be removed when data is retentioned. It will also remove any file uploads, that's any files that have been uploaded to that case. And it will also, if the case is linked to a user account, it will remove the link between the user and the case as well, so that you've got no way of tracking that back. So things to put in place in order to use the service API to redact data. So you can see here, I've got a dashboard filter that I've called to be redacted. And I've literally set this filter up based on a case value. So I have a case value that indicates, effectively a choice field that indicates whether a case should be redacted or not. So this field is set up just as a choice field, available to all services, visible to specific roles. I've also checked to say that it contains sensitive data, and I'll explain why I've done that in a minute. And basically the choice options are just yes or no. So what I want to do is, when a case is due to be redacted, I want to have a rule that sets this value against the case and sets the choice option to yes. So it will then pull that into my dashboard for data retention. So what I really want to do is base setting this value on what we call a case date. So I want to say, in my example, let's say after 2 years, after a case is created, I'm going to want to redact the data. So what I need to do is create a case date in Jadu Connect. So under settings and communication, you have a section called dates that allows you to configure dates that you can then use to trigger actions within Jadu Connect. So in this case, I've called my date redaction date. I'm basing it on the date the case is created, plus 2 years. So it will look at the date the case is created and it will calculate a date in 2 years' time. And I've basically just given the system administrator view to this because we're just going to use it in the background in a rule. It's not a date that anyone needs to necessarily see within a case. So whenever a case is created, the system will automatically calculate when the redaction date is going to be. What I then have is within my individual case, so let's take my business inquiry case type, I can set a rule to make sure that when the case hits this date, it sets my to be redacted case value. So I'm going to create a new rule. I'm going to give it a title. When I create rules in Connect, what I tend to do is actually prefix the rule with the sort of title, a prefix of whatever the main action of that rule is going to be. So even if that rule is triggering multiple actions, I'll have to think about what the main action is that really is triggering everything and use that as a prefix. So this is going to be my rule to set my redaction filter. So my trigger is going to be a date. And in here, I've got a whole list of dates. Let's find and I've got my redaction date here. So this is this. So effectively, this is going to say when that date is reached for this particular, then what I want to do is set a case value. To be redacted, and I want to set that value to yes. So for each case of this type that's created, it's going to calculate the redaction date. When that redaction date is reached on the case, it will set the value to be redacted. Now, if you are looking at setting up sort of redaction dates in the past, so maybe you've got a lot of cases set up in your system, and you want to calculate a redaction date going back further. What you could do is create a rule to do that. So in this case, I'm going to say calculate redaction date. So what I might say is what I want to do is on a particular date and time. So let's say I want to do this tomorrow at 12:30 in the morning. And I want to recalculate a date. Again, I'll find my redaction date. There we go. So if I set this rule up, this rule will effectively run once against this case type, and it will then calculate historic redaction dates for any cases that don't have a redaction date, if that case date hasn't existed previously. So you can use that as a way to retrospectively calculate those dates so that you can then use those in historic cases as well. So effectively, I've got my case date, I've got my choice field to indicate whether a case should be redacted or not, and then I've got a case value rule that sets that redaction value based on the case reaching its redaction date. So as soon as the case reaches its redaction date, it will set the value to yes, and then that case will be added to my redaction filter. Are there any questions about that process so far? Do we need to calculate the case created date? No, case created date is always automatically created when the case is raised. So there's no need to set a calculation date for that. Equally, when a case is closed, the system should record a close date as well. So if I go back in here, I might want to base my redaction date on the date the case is completed instead of the date the case was created. So I might say once that case has been processed, then after 2 years we want to clear it down. So you have a couple of options. So either do it on the date the case was created, I would suggest, or the alternative I'd suggest is to do it based on the date the case is completed. So these are both sort of system dates. And any other questions about the case date, setting the flag, and creating the dashboard? One thing just to cover off is I've got a feeling some of the documentation suggests maybe calculating the date based on the time that a case is in a particular status. What I try to do is avoid that, because one thing you can do with the redaction API is you can say actually run it based on this and then transition it to a different status. But that, in my perspective, I'd always try and do it just based on a specific period, because if you're, for example, not moving a case to a final status until it's been redacted, then that could potentially prevent you from raising additional cases against an address, if that address is limited to a specific number of open cases against it. So I tend to generate my filter based on using just a case value flag rather than anything else. Let's have a look. So we've got a question from Joan. Should all admin users have the ability to select workflow from settings? We can only see it from utilities. Workflow in utilities, that would be in Jadu Central. And this doesn't relate to workflows in relation to Connect. So this is just workflow in terms of content approval within the content management side of things. So that this isn't related to Jadu Connect at all, but admin users who have access to Jadu Connect should have access to workflow in here. If that's not the case, it's probably a case of checking permissions, but the out-of-the-box administrator role in Jadu Connect should have access to this for building workflows. Let's have a look. Kerry's got a question. I have a lot of forms we'd like to implement this on to remove past data. I'm not sure what the timescale is. So Kerry's asking about the timescale for implementing the actual UI in Connect for configuring the data retention. So at the moment, there isn't a specific timeline. I think they were looking at September when we spoke to a previous customer. But I can check that with the product team as well. Okay. So hopefully setting up the dashboard filter in Connect should be relatively straightforward. The next step is where you actually need to run the retention API call against that dashboard. So I've got my to be redacted dashboard filter. And you can see I've got a whole number of cases in here. And these have got, customer data recorded against them. So I want to run my redaction rule to remove that data. So the manual gives you sort of instructions on what's needed to do this. But I'm going to just sort of show you as sort of a brief overview. So what I need to do is create a URL string in order to create this. So if I click on my filter, you'll see it gives me the sort of a little bit on my URL showing me what that filter ID really is. So I can copy that. And I'm going to need to use sort of a bit of third-party software. There's lots of different solutions you can use for this. Thing that I've got is a thing called Postman, which is like a lightweight API solution that you can use for free. So what I'm going to want to do is create a service API URL. So in terms of the beginning of the URL, where I can get this from is if I go to Connect, I go to Settings and System, and the Service APIs, if I select, I'm going to use my XFP user, you can see here, I've got a URI that I can use. So this would form the first part of my redaction URL. I then add this little bit of code in. So this is in the manual. We've got this here. And then I basically need to just add on to the end the identifier for my dashboard filter. I need to make sure that this is set to run in post. And the other thing I need to do is put my API key in. So in the manual, you can see it gives the key. So what I do in Postman, I've added that in as my key value. And then I've literally, in the API, copied my API key and pasted that in as the value as well. Now, the beauty of this is I can if I sign up for a free account on Postman, I can actually save this, so I don't have to do this every time I want to run it. But effectively, you need the URL. You need to select headers. If in this particular instance, pop in the key, pop in the value of your API key. And then what I should be able to do is just click send, and that will run it. So with any luck, if I go back to my filter and go into one of those cases, oh, it's not worked. Wonder why that is. Wonder if I've changed the key somewhere. But what that should do, let me see if I can find an example of one I did previously. So effectively, it should go in. It should show that this data has been deleted. It's obviously something I've not put in correctly in the setup at this side. So I need to check that with my colleagues who use this a bit more than I do. But it should show then that these fields are deleted. So it'll show the field name, but you'll just get a red block that says deleted next to it when it's deleted. And I said it will remove any of these links, and it will also remove any files that have been uploaded. In terms of the choice field, the reason I have set this to say it contains sensitive data is because what I want to do is once the data has been retentioned against a case, I want it to be removed from my dashboard filter. So basically, if I set my field to contain sensitive data, when my data redaction API call runs, it's going to remove that value because that value is what the filter is based on. It will then remove that case from the filter. So you'll only ever have case data in the filter for cases that you need to actually redact. It won't contain any historic cases. Does that kind of make sense for everyone? I said it's a bit trickier in terms of Jadu Connect at the moment. It can be done. You can create those API calls. If you have a sort of better understanding potentially with API calls than I do, you can potentially schedule them to run as well. But there is a plan, as I said, to have more of a sort of user interface similar to the one in Jadu Central to be able to manually configure these retention policies a lot easier in Jadu Connect. Molly's asking if the user interface will also deal with older cases. My assumption is it will, because, for example, in here, when you set these rules, it will look at any sort of case is that any form submissions that meet those criteria and should then clear them down. So my assumption is that, you know, the UI in Connect will be constructed in a similar way. I will double check that with the product team though for you. The next masterclass we've got coming up, I think next month, is going to be on home pages. So you'll receive a notification when that's open for sign up. But as I've said, if anyone has any ideas for anything they'd particularly like to address in a masterclass or for me to run through, then by all means, drop me an email. The easiest email is just paul@jadu.co.uk. That'll get to me. Drop me an email and then we can look at those requests and we can use those for scheduling some more masterclasses. As I said, we initially just scheduled for the 4 initially, but we are planning on extending those. So there won't be a gap. So even if we don't get many suggestions, we'll still make sure that we've got plenty of things in the pipeline for you. But ideally, we'd like the suggestions to come from you so that we know, what it is that you're particularly looking at advice and guidance for. Thanks for everyone's time today. I hope it's been useful. And I'll speak to you all again soon.